Long before his name became a whisper of peace, the man who would be called Ashoka was born into a world ruled by the sword. The Mauryan Empire stretched wide across the ancient plains of India, its cities pulsing with traders, soldiers, and scribes. Palaces gleamed with gold, roads echoed with the march of armies. Empire was a living thing, always hungry, always reaching. Amid this greatness, a child opened his eyes beneath banners of war. They said he was restless even as a boy. When others studied the arts of philosophy or dance, he chased the sound of steel. He watched soldiers train in the courtyards, memorized the movements of the spear, the weight of a blade. Tutors told him of duty, of dharma, of the righteousness of rule, but their words slid past him like rain on armor. The fire within him burned too brightly to be soothed by scripture. As he grew, he became both admired and feared. His half-brothers plotted, sensing danger in his ambition. Courtiers whispered that he was too fierce, too unyielding, that his eyes held storms. But Emperor Bindusara, his father, saw in him a spark of destiny. He sent the young prince to the provinces to govern, to test his strength not just in battle but in rule. Ashoka's rule in Ujjain was swift and severe. Rebels were crushed, laws enforced without mercy. Yet beneath the iron lay precision. He understood order, he understood fear. When news of his victories reached Pataliputra, the capital, even his enemies admitted that he ruled as the empire itself ruled, through discipline, power, and will. But destiny is never content with mere obedience. When Bindusara died, the empire trembled under the weight of succession. Brothers turned against brothers, generals chose sides, and blood ran in the palace corridors. Out of the chaos, one figure rose like a shadow made solid. Ashoka took the throne not by inheritance but by conquest. The coronation was silent, the empire held its breath. A new emperor had come, one who understood war too well. In the early years of his reign, the land prospered under the same firm hand that had once drawn blood. Roads were repaired, trade expanded, and justice, harsh, efficient, ruled the courts. To his subjects, he was both protector and predator, a ruler who saw everything and forgot nothing. Some said he slept with his sword by his bed even after victory. Others claimed he never slept at all. Yet something stirred within him that even he could not name. Each morning he looked upon the empire he had forged, and the question returned like an echo: what was left to conquer once everything lay beneath his feet? His answer came in the form of a kingdom, Kalinga, proud, independent, and unwilling to bow. Nestled along the eastern coast, it stood as the last bright flame beyond Mauryan reach. Advisors warned him of the cost. The people of Kalinga were fierce and loyal, the land would not fall easily. But Ashoka, bound by ambition and pride, declared that peace born of submission was better than freedom born of defiance. So began a war that would change not only a man but the memory of civilization itself. The armies gathered, legions upon legions stretching beyond sight. Drums thundered through forests, banners blackened the sky. When Ashoka rode at their head, his armor gleamed like dawn, his presence as commanding as a god's. The fields of Kalinga became the anvil upon which empire and conscience would collide. The first clashes were swift and brutal. Kalinga's defenders fought with the desperation of those who have nothing left to lose. Villages burned, rivers ran red, and the cries of the dying rose higher than the war horns. For every victory Ashoka won, something unseen within him faltered. Each fallen soldier, each mother's wail, each smoke-filled horizon carved a mark he could not erase. When at last the city of Kalinga fell, the emperor rode through the aftermath. Corpses lay like scattered leaves, and the stench of death clung to the wind. He dismounted, stepping over the bodies of his own men, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if searching for a reason that no longer existed. A monk approached him, old, thin, eyes like calm water. The man bowed and said nothing. In that silence, Ashoka heard more than he had ever heard in war. He turned to the monk and asked what he sought in such ruin. The monk answered simply that he sought nothing, for all things pass. Then he pointed to the slain and asked the emperor, "When these pass, what will remain of you?" Ashoka could not answer. The words sank into him like arrows. That night, beneath a sky still veiled with smoke, he sat alone. The victory feast went on without him. He looked at his hands, steady and strong, yet suddenly foreign. They had shaped history, now they trembled. As dawn rose, a new kind of silence spread across the camps. The emperor who had conquered a kingdom did not speak. His generals waited for orders to celebrate, but none came. Instead, he walked among the wounded, both enemy and ally, and for the first time saw no difference between them. From that moment, the empire would never be the same. Ashoka ordered the fires extinguished, the prisoners released, and the dead honored with rites. He returned to his capital not as a victor, but as a man haunted by victory itself. At Pataliputra, he withdrew from the splendor of court. He wandered the gardens where peacocks sang and fountains played, yet found no peace. Advisors watched him in confusion. Where was the fierce ruler who once ruled with the edge of his will? Instead, they saw a man staring into still water, as if the reflection might answer what the world could not. Days passed, then weeks, until one morning, a messenger arrived bearing the words of a wandering monk. He spoke of the Buddha, of compassion, of a path that turned suffering into wisdom. Ashoka listened, truly listened, for the first time in years. And something within him broke, then mended, as though a long-forgotten truth had been waiting for this moment. He sought the monk's counsel, learning not of gods or kingdoms but of the heart. The lessons were simple, the practice profound. Power, the monk said, is fleeting. Compassion endures. To rule wisely is to see oneself in every soul that kneels before the throne. That night, Ashoka dreamt of the battlefield once more, but where there had been blood, he saw rivers running clear. Where corpses had lain, flowers now bloomed. When he awoke, he knew the war was over, not the one waged with armies but the one within himself. In the years that followed, those who had once feared his wrath began to fear his silence instead. The emperor moved through his palace with a calm that unsettled even his most loyal guards. He no longer spoke of conquest or tribute. His thoughts had turned inward toward a kingdom unseen. Ministers brought petitions for war, for expansion, for revenge against distant tribes, but he waved them away with a gentleness they could not understand. Word spread that the emperor had changed. Some called it weakness, others called it enlightenment. He himself called it awakening. He decreed that from that day forward, no living being should suffer needlessly under his rule. The empire that had once trembled at his armies now trembled at his mercy. Ashoka ordered that trees be planted along the roads to shade travelers from the sun. Wells were dug in barren lands so that even strangers might drink. Hospitals were built not only for men but for animals, and the cry of the wounded elephant or the broken horse was answered with the same care as a soldier's wound. To those who had known only the iron of his command, this new compassion seemed miraculous, impossible, even dangerous. When emissaries came from distant lands, from the mountains of the north, the deserts of the west, the islands beyond the sea, they found an emperor who spoke of peace as though it were a weapon stronger than any blade. He sent gifts, not threats, words, not armies. He spoke of Dharma, the right path, not as law but as harmony, a way of living that bound all beings together. In his heart, he carried the memory of Kalinga, a scar that reminded him of the price of ignorance. Every decision, every act of mercy was a step toward redemption, not for the empire but for his own soul. Years passed and the pillars rose. Across the empire, stone columns were carved with his words, standing tall against the horizon like sentinels of conscience. Travelers paused to read the inscriptions etched deep into the rock, not declarations of power but lessons of humility. They spoke of tolerance among all faiths, of the duty of rulers to protect rather than punish, of the kindness that holds the world together. Each word was chosen carefully, not to command but to remind. The emperor knew that time would erode all things, cities, armies, even memory, but perhaps, he thought, stone could carry the whisper of compassion farther than any voice. He no longer wore the jewels of conquest. His robes grew simpler, his court quieter. He walked among monks and villagers alike, speaking not as a sovereign but as a man seeking understanding. Sometimes he would pause before one of his own pillars, running his fingers along the chiseled lines, as though confirming that what he had once ordered in stone still lived within him. His ministers worried. Without war, how could an empire stay strong? Without fear, how could subjects stay loyal? But Ashoka had seen too much of strength and loyalty to be deceived by them. He said that fear was a wall and walls always fall, compassion was a bridge and bridges endure. He sent emissaries far beyond his borders, to the kingdoms of Sri Lanka, to the distant lands of Syria and Egypt, carrying gifts, scrolls, and messages of peace. These were not missionaries of conquest but of goodwill. He believed that even the most distant nations could be bound by understanding. And though few of those messages survived the centuries, the idea behind them did, that the world could be united by kindness rather than control. In his old age, Ashoka became something few rulers ever had the courage to become, small before the truth. He would sit for hours beneath the shade of trees planted by his own decree, watching the people pass. He found joy in the sight of children running barefoot along the roads, in farmers sharing water from a well, in the quiet laughter of the monks who tended the gardens. The empire he had once sought to expand through violence now expanded through peace. But even peace has its challenges. Within the court, whispers began again. Some nobles saw his turn toward compassion as weakness. Others feared that his dream of universal goodwill would dissolve the empire's power. Yet Ashoka no longer ruled through fear of rebellion. He ruled through the weight of example. Those who sought to oppose him found themselves disarmed, not by armies but by his conviction. He spoke rarely now, but when he did, his words carried the clarity of still water. He said that the true conquest is not over others but over oneself, that the greatest victory is not of kingdoms but of the heart. He spoke as a man who had seen every side of power and found only emptiness where pride once lived. He began to write letters to his people, etched again upon stone. In them he confessed his own failings, his anger, his cruelty, his blindness. He told them that if he who had been emperor of the world could change, then no man was beyond redemption. He ordered his messages to be placed where travelers could see them, by rivers, in markets, along roads, so that no one could pass through his realm without hearing the call to mercy. Over time his empire grew quieter. The sound of battle faded, replaced by the hum of markets, the rhythm of prayers, the music of life uninterrupted by fear. For the first time, people began to speak of an empire at peace, not through domination but through compassion. And yet, even in his peace, the emperor remained human. There were nights when the ghosts of Kalinga returned, when the cries of the dead echoed through his dreams. He would wake before dawn and walk the gardens alone, barefoot upon the dewy grass, whispering the names of those lost to his ambition. His attendants feared to disturb him, for they knew the burden of memory is not easily shared. He prayed not for forgiveness but for understanding, that the pain he carried might remind him, and through him, the world, of what must never be repeated. In time even his regrets softened. The visions of war faded, replaced by faces of those who now lived because of his mercy. He began to see the empire not as a thing to own, but as a garden to tend, fragile, changing, alive. And in that tending he found something close to peace. He was no longer Ashoka the conqueror. He was Ashoka the compassionate. And in his final years he came to believe that perhaps the pillars he had raised were not monuments to his reign, but markers of a path, one that every generation would have to walk again, if the world was to remain worthy of itself. He began to travel once more, not at the head of armies but surrounded by monks and scholars, his steps slow, his gaze distant. Wherever he went, people gathered, not out of fear or obligation, but curiosity and affection. Children followed him through villages, offering flowers or fruit, their laughter unburdened by the shadows that had once haunted the empire. He accepted every gift with a quiet smile, his eyes softened by time. The people no longer saw a ruler, they saw a teacher who had learned the hardest lesson of all, that power without compassion is hollow. In the monasteries of the north, he sat with wise men and listened to the teachings of the Buddha. He asked questions that few emperors would ever dare to ask. What is the nature of peace? Can a man who has spilled blood ever truly find forgiveness? The monks did not give him answers. They only invited him to sit in silence and listen, to the wind through the trees, to the breath within his own chest. In that stillness, Ashoka found something more profound than victory. He found surrender. It was not the surrender of defeat, but of awakening. He realized that the throne, the crown, the armies, the wealth, all of it was transient. Empires were sand, shifting with the tide. What endured was not dominion, but understanding. What ruled the world was not might, but balance. As he aged, his body weakened, but his mind grew sharper, his heart lighter. He no longer sought to leave behind monuments of grandeur. His concern was the unseen legacy, the quiet revolution of kindness spreading through his people. His decrees had reached far-off lands. His emissaries had carried the message of peace beyond the borders of his own empire. Farmers who once tilled land soaked in blood now sowed seeds under the promise of protection. Children who might have been soldiers grew into scholars, healers, poets. His courtiers sometimes asked him why he no longer pursued expansion, why he allowed rival kingdoms to flourish untouched. He would answer that to rule all men is to rule none. He said the world was vast enough for all hearts that beat with sincerity. Power that depends on fear is fragile. Power born of love endures beyond death. One evening, as the sun descended into the western forests, Ashoka stood upon the balcony of his palace. The light painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson, and the Ganges shimmered like molten metal below. He remembered standing on another field long ago, beneath a sky filled with smoke and screams. Now there was only the sound of the river and the call of birds returning home. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer, not to a god but to the world itself, that it might remember what he had learned so dearly. In his later years he spoke less and wrote more. His words, carved in stone, were his testament to the ages. He knew that one day the empire would fall, that the pillars might crumble and the roads crack, but perhaps someone, somewhere, would find the words again and understand. He was no longer writing for his subjects, he was writing for time. He dictated his final inscriptions slowly, his voice steady, his meaning clear. He wrote that all men are his children and that the ruler must care for them as a father does for his own. He spoke of tolerance between faiths, of patience in judgment, of the small acts of kindness that build the foundation of peace. He declared that to honor life in all its forms is to honor the truth that binds creation together. And then, as if addressing the centuries themselves, he warned that those who forget compassion will lose the right to rule. When the inscriptions were complete, he asked that they be placed far and wide, at crossroads, near rivers, in the mountains, in markets, so that even the traveler who walked alone might read and carry the message onward. The stone carvers labored for years, and when they were done, the empire was covered with the emperor's heart made visible in words. Time passed and the emperor grew frail. His once commanding presence softened, his voice quieter but still filled with gravity. He began to spend his days in the gardens, surrounded by the hum of bees and the scent of flowers. Visitors would find him sitting beneath a tree, speaking gently to those who approached. He would ask about their lives, their families, their troubles, and offer words of comfort rather than command. He had become a ruler of hearts, not lands. Even in his old age he was not blind to suffering. He continued to send aid to those struck by famine, to the wounded in distant provinces, to the orphans left by disease or disaster. He told his ministers that an empire is not measured by its wealth but by the number of its people who sleep without fear. On one of his last journeys he visited Kalinga once more. The land had healed, its fields were green, its villages alive. The people welcomed him not as the conqueror who had brought ruin, but as the wise king who had brought peace. As he walked through the same valley where once the ground had been soaked in blood, he saw children running through the grass and farmers tending crops beneath the sun. He bowed his head, tears tracing the lines of his weathered face. He had come full circle. The man who had once stood atop the world now stood humbled before it. He placed his hand upon the earth and whispered a vow that his empire would never again rise upon suffering. That vow, he knew, was greater than any conquest. Years faded, and the emperor became a legend even while he still lived. Stories of his transformation spread beyond the borders of his realm, crossing seas and deserts. Foreign kings sent messengers seeking to learn the secret of his peace. Some understood, some did not, for not all men are ready to believe that gentleness can hold the same power as the sword. But those who did return to their lands changed, carrying with them the seed of his message. When he returned to his capital for the last time, the streets were filled with people who came not to demand but to give thanks. They threw flowers before his chariot and sang songs of his compassion. Ashoka smiled, though his eyes were distant, already looking toward a horizon beyond this life. He knew that he had been both destroyer and creator, both darkness and light. In the end, perhaps that was what it meant to be human, to fall, to rise, to seek. In the final years of his life, Ashoka withdrew more and more from the affairs of court. The halls that had once echoed with the clang of armor and the murmur of ministers were now filled with silence and the scent of sandalwood. He no longer sought to shape the world through decrees. Instead, he sought to understand it through reflection. He spent his mornings in meditation and his evenings walking through the gardens he had built decades ago. The trees had grown tall, their roots were deep now, like his peace. Visitors often found him seated beneath a banyan tree, gazing at the horizon as if reading a message written upon the air. They would bow, expecting wisdom, and he would simply tell them to listen, to the river, to the wind, to their own hearts. The world, he said once, speaks to those who are quiet enough to hear it. He began to record his thoughts not for others but for himself. In quiet moments, he would write upon palm leaves or dictate to scribes passages that spoke of compassion, duty, and the impermanence of all things. He wrote that no man, no empire, no belief could claim eternity, for everything that rises must fall, and everything that falls may rise again in another form. His courtiers still came to him with matters of state, but he no longer ruled as before. He guided them with gentleness, urging them to seek solutions through understanding, not authority. When disputes arose, he reminded them that victory achieved through anger is no victory at all. Some of them thought he had grown soft with age, but others saw the quiet strength that had replaced the fire of his youth. He spoke often of the Buddha's path, not as religion but as realization. He told his ministers that the duty of a ruler is not to control his people but to protect their right to live in peace. He told his son that the truest inheritance is not the throne but the wisdom to use it wisely. When sickness began to touch him, he did not call for the healers or magicians of the court. He accepted it as part of the order of things. His body had served its purpose. His spirit had found its truth. Still he remained patient and kind, never allowing pain to darken his temper. He continued to meet with monks, philosophers, and travelers, listening more than he spoke. To one young monk who asked him if he feared death, he smiled faintly and said, "How can I fear a door that leads only to another room?" His days grew shorter but his peace grew wider. The empire continued to function, guided by the laws and values he had set down. Though distant provinces still whispered of rebellion and foreign borders shifted like tides, the heart of the Mauryan realm remained calm, bound by the moral gravity of the emperor's will. Toward the end, he asked to be taken once more to the great hall where he had been crowned. It was empty now, the golden banners faded, the marble floor worn smooth by the feet of generations. He stood where his throne had once been and looked up at the carvings upon the walls, scenes of conquest and glory. He traced them with his eyes, remembering each campaign, each victory, each loss. Then he said softly, "All of this was illusion. The real empire was here," and placed his hand upon his chest. When he left the hall he did not look back. He returned to the gardens where the air smelled of rain and earth. There he spent his last weeks surrounded by monks, his daughters, and a few old friends who had survived the storms of his reign. They spoke little, there was nothing left to say. At night, he would gaze at the stars and wonder if the souls of those he had wronged looked back at him through the light of distant worlds. He hoped they had found peace, and if not, he prayed they would forgive him when he joined them. One morning, as the first light touched the horizon, the emperor rose before anyone else. He walked slowly to the edge of the palace gardens, where a small stream glimmered among the stones. He knelt beside it, cupped the water in his hands and watched it slip through his fingers. It was then that he understood the full meaning of his life, that nothing is ever truly held, only shared for a time. He smiled at the thought. A monk who had followed him from afar approached and asked if he wished to return to the palace. Ashoka shook his head. "I am already home," he said. Then he closed his eyes, and the sound of the stream became the sound of all the rivers he had ever crossed. They found him there not long after, seated beneath the same tree where he had often meditated. His face was serene, his hands resting gently on his knees. It was said that even the birds fell silent for a time, as though the world itself paused to honor his passing. The news spread slowly, carried by messengers who rode across the empire's vast expanse. In villages and cities, people gathered to light lamps for the emperor who had turned war into wisdom. They spoke of him not as a conqueror, but as a man who had conquered himself. The empire mourned, but it did not despair. For in his death, Ashoka had left behind not emptiness, but direction. His ashes were divided, as was the custom, and enshrined in stupas across the land. Each one became a beacon of peace, a place where strangers stood side by side in quiet reflection. They did not pray for him, they prayed with him for the world he had envisioned to continue beyond his life. The years turned into centuries. Dynasties rose and fell, kingdoms warred and vanished, but the memory of Ashoka endured. His pillars weathered the storms, their inscriptions fading but never disappearing. Travelers who found them often could not read the ancient script, but they felt something in the presence of the stone. A stillness, a dignity, a whisper of meaning that transcended words. As time passed, the story of the emperor who renounced violence became legend. Some called him saint, others myth. But the truth, like the pillars he left behind, stood quietly among the ruins, waiting to be rediscovered. Centuries drifted past like sand through an unseen glass. The empire that Ashoka had once ruled dissolved into memory, its marble halls reclaimed by vines, its roads broken by roots. Kingdoms rose upon its ashes and vanished in their turn. The pillars he had raised still stood, scattered across plains and jungles, their inscriptions worn but not erased. Travelers passed them without understanding, unaware that beneath the fading script lay the voice of a king who had once turned his sword into silence. In the ages that followed, his name grew faint, a rumor among ruins. Some called him a legend told by wandering monks, others dismissed him as a fable meant to soothe the conscience of empires. Yet truth, though buried, has a way of breathing again. And so it was that centuries later, long after his monuments had been swallowed by earth and time, Ashoka returned, not in body but in remembrance. It began with a scholar, walking beneath the relentless sun of northern India. He came upon a pillar rising from the dust, taller than a man, carved from a single stone that glowed faintly gold. Around its base the air shimmered with heat, and the earth smelled of history. The scholar brushed away centuries of soil and traced the ancient letters with trembling fingers. He could not read them yet, but he knew what he had found was not a relic of conquest but of conscience. Years later, when the script was deciphered, the world heard Ashoka's voice again. His words spoke not of war but of compassion, not of glory but of humanity. "All men are my children," he had written, "and I desire for them welfare and happiness in this world and the next." Those words, silent for 2,000 years, echoed once more across the world. Historians gathered to piece together the life of the lost emperor. They learned of his rise through blood, his transformation through grief, his reign of mercy that had followed. They saw that his empire had stretched farther than any before it, but that his true dominion was over the human heart. The discovery reshaped history's understanding of kingship itself. For once, the mightiest ruler of his age had used his power not to command fear, but to plant peace. As the story spread, Ashoka's name became known again, not as the conqueror of Kalinga, but as the emperor of Dharma, the law of truth, balance, and compassion. Monks in distant lands began to speak his name with reverence. Artists painted his image with gentle eyes, and nations far removed from his own took his wheel of law, the Dharma chakra, as their symbol of unity. But beyond the scholars and statues, something quieter stirred. Ordinary people began to find meaning in his story. In classrooms, children listened wide-eyed as they heard how a king who had wielded unstoppable armies had chosen instead to wield forgiveness. In temples, monks told the tale as a lesson in the impermanence of power. Even in places where his name was little known, the spirit of his message found a home. The world, still scarred by war and division, began to rediscover his ancient truth, that no victory is worth the loss of compassion, and that no empire outlasts kindness. In a way, Ashoka's second reign began not through force or decree, but through remembrance. His words reached across time, whispering to a modern age more in need of them than ever. They spoke to rulers who measured greatness in power, reminding them that greatness lies in restraint. They spoke to people divided by creed and color, reminding them that compassion sees no borders. They spoke to those who felt the weight of guilt, assuring them that redemption is never beyond reach. And though the world had changed beyond all recognition, the pulse of his message remained the same, that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of understanding. In the ruins of his old capital, now swallowed by fields and forests, a traveler once stood before one of the last surviving pillars. The stone was cracked, the carvings nearly gone, but a few words could still be read under the afternoon sun. The traveler read them aloud softly, the sound mingling with the rustle of leaves. The words were simple, almost childlike in their clarity: "May all beings live without harm." The traveler stood for a long time, imagining the man who had written them. He saw an emperor surrounded by soldiers, staring out at a field of the dead and choosing, in that moment, to become something greater than his crown. He saw the same man years later, bent with age, smiling at a child offering a flower. The image lingered like a vision, realer than the ruins themselves. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain. The traveler bowed before the pillar and whispered, "We have not forgotten." And perhaps, in that moment, across the ages, the spirit of the emperor smiled. For no story truly ends. It merely changes its shape, like water finding new paths through the earth. The story of Ashoka was not a tale of kings and wars, but of awakening, of one man who learned that the greatest throne is the heart that chooses mercy. His empire had vanished, but his truth endured, waiting in stone and silence until the world was ready to listen again. And so it was that throne unknown, the story of a ruler who renounced power for peace, became not a forgotten legend, but a mirror held up to humanity itself. Every age that rediscovers him must decide anew whether it will rule by the sword or by the spirit. The stones still stand, patient as ever, their message clear to those who care to read. The mightiest of kings is the one who conquers his own heart.